and leaves nought but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward, though I cannae see, I guess and fear.
So that was just a bit of a different way to start, folks. I hope you appreciated it for what it was. We will, and you could hear it okay, because otherwise this was just a really awkward 2 minutes. So marvelous. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Our first tasting of the year. We were unfortunately meant to have one a bit earlier, as I think I mentioned the last tasting, but there was just some logistical issues. So that one hasn't been cancelled. It's just simply been rearranged. So and we've got a Lefroy one that will be going on sale next week for February. So there'll be plenty coming. So apologies that this one, probably about a month gap, probably our longest gap since last August. So I hope you haven't missed us too much. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to Digital Drams. We're very excited to have you. Yeah, if it is your first time, we want you to be as engaged as possible. Do give us your tasting notes, your questions, get them in the chat, and hopefully we'll have a fun evening together. And at the end, there'll be 15% off all the drams tried tonight. So stick around for that. I suppose that's enough for me. Michael, do you want to tell everyone about yourself and maybe give us, I know you only just said it to me before we came live, but give everyone the running order.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Luke. My name is Michael Stephenson. I am the UK brand ambassador for Compass Box Whiskey. Yeah, looking forward to sharing some fantastic drams with you this evening. A little bit of a story about the brand, about where we started, where we come from, how we view the world of whiskey. And then we'll taste through some fantastic drams. We have this evening, the running order will be Hedonism, will be the first dram of the night. We will follow that with Glasgow Blend. From there, we will lead into Orchard House, and then across to the story of the Spaniard. And we will finish with the Peat Monster, which save your taste buds for that at the end.
Marvelous. Perfect. So you were obviously on with us. I suppose it was November or October 2022.
Yeah,
I must say, when we were liaising around this tasting beforehand, in my head it was much more recent than that. So we've got a couple of different drams than that time. So it's not too much for anyone who was on that first tasting, which I can see a few names definitely were on here. And it'd be a good refresher for what is a great brand. I know that the first one we're going to start with, Michael, the Hedonism went down really well last time. I think it was the dram of the night, according to most people. So a good one to start on again.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's exciting to hear. So yeah, we will start with that, and I think yeah, we'll get to taste through it, and then I've got some fun news to share for everyone on hedonism, so we can go through that too. So yeah, I mean, if you are happy, we can dive into that.
Yeah, perfect. I think now's as good a time as any.
Yeah, cool. Let me just pop this up very briefly. So yeah, essentially, I just wanted to take you through a little bit of the story of Compass Box just to start with. I won't bore you too much before we start drinking some whiskey, but it's also just good to know where we come from. So Compass Box started in the year 2000 by an American gentleman called Mr. John Glaser. So I always say to people that we were founded by an American. We are based here in London. We make Scotch whiskey, and we evidently employ South Africans. So we are a very blended company to the core of what we do. So John, essentially the idea was he used to work for Johnny Walker previously. He was also incredibly passionate about wine before he got sucked into the world of whiskey. And John left Johnny Walker in order to start his own business in 2000, because it just felt like the 1990s had really slowed down for whiskey in general. Blended whiskey in particular had hit a bit of a slow spot and started to decline in sales. And John felt like bringing some new energy to the category. So wanted to focus a bit more on innovation, less on trying to adhere to really old recipes, and even look at sort of updating the labelings, so that the whiskey bottles didn't look like they all came out of the 1970s when we were on the dawn of a new millennium. So That was his plan. I think he had taken a lot of influence from the world of wine and how these new world wines had started challenging old world wine, and being a bit more creative and innovative, and really pushing the conversation forward. And that's essentially what he aimed to do. So we say we are looking to make the world of Scotch whiskey a more interesting place, and that's sort of our goal. So John would have started off, and he did just that when he started off, because the first whiskey he ever created was Hedonism, which at the time was the first ever blended grain Scotch whiskey on the market. So obviously we'll dive into it a little bit later on. That the two main styles are whiskey in Scotland, single malt and single grain. You used to get single malt whiskey, obviously, in the 2000s. This was around, it had become quite popular again. You obviously had blended Scotch, and then very, very rarely you would get single grain whiskey. So it wasn't something that a lot of people used to focus on. It wasn't something that a lot of companies used to release on its own. And you didn't get blended grain at all at this point. So John said to me that he was having a chat to the people at the company when he was working for them previously, and he had tasted some beautiful grain whiskies. They had taken some of their blends and sort of exploded them out, and were having a look at the components of these. And one of those was, lovely older grain whiskies. And he turned around and he said, why are we not releasing this? Why is this not something that we are putting out into the public? And they just said, we don't think people will understand grain whiskey. So John, he says a lot of what he's done in this business has been in the defense of common sense. So he turned around and said, well, for me, if it's beautiful grain whiskey and it tastes delicious and we put it in front of people, I think they'll really enjoy it. So that was his goal with this whiskey, was to go and just showcase how good, really good grain whiskey can be. So blended grain Scotch whiskey, you're looking at very active wood. So first fill as well as recharred American oak. So if you want to get right into this, it's a good a place as any to start. What you'll notice on the nose is beautiful sort of vanillas, caramels, butterscotch, lovely pastry cream notes, hints of coconut that will probably come through as well. So lovely and indulgent on the nose. And when you follow that up and go into the palate of it, you'll notice that it really does follow through with that. A very elegant on the palate, quite nice and indulgent. I say to people that there's sort of two ways to describe this whiskey. One is that it's a little bit like liquid creme brulee. And the other one is that it's, if you think of a bourbon that grew up and went to private school. So for me, that's it's got all those sort of familiar characteristics of a bourbon, those vanillas and caramels and quite rich profiles, but it's just got a lot less of that sort of rough edges and a lot more elegant and refined on the palate. So quite an interesting thing to come straight out the gate with. And I think it definitely made quite a big statement when we arrived on the market with it. And it was something completely different. And even if you look at the landscape today, you'll find that you have sort of grain whiskies that will come out either as single grain or blended grains to sort of recruit people into the category of whiskey, quite cheap and sort of quite bland in terms of flavor profile, nothing too confrontational, I suppose. And then you'll get single grain whiskies that are a lot older, sort of unique and rare bottlings that will come out. And there doesn't seem to be a lot that plays in that middle ground of just really beautiful premium blended grain Scotch whiskey. So I feel like we are sort of a category of wine in that space in a lot of ways. But it's something that we've always wanted to pioneer, and it's just celebrated its 23rd anniversary now. So it's something that's very close to our hearts, and it's something that we always will make. So I hope everyone is enjoying that. The news that I do want to share with you, however, is that this is, see that if we'll click through here. So this is a blend breakdown, which you can get, and we'll go through all of these, which is always available. You'll see a really good mix of grain whiskies. So you've got some Cameron Bridge, you've got some North British, you've got some Girvan inside of there, and some Portland Ass. A mix of ages. So the trick with Compass Box, whenever you look at these wheels, is that you can actually count the rings, and they will indicate to you how much the age is. Obviously, this might be a bit small. You can pull all this information directly off the website, so it will make it a lot easier for you to be able to drill down into the information. But realistically, you're looking between 15 to 24-year-old grain whiskies. And like I say, just very active casts. So first fill as well as recharred American oak. So you've got a lot of that influence coming through. The challenge for us is that obviously this whiskey retailing around about £75 a bottle. So in terms of our core range, already sitting quite high, whereas everything else sort of peaks at about £50 and starts, 55 to £60 and starts at about 40.
Well, I have some good news on that front, Michael. So
yes,
this week retails in the whiskey shop for £72, but obviously at the end of the night when you get your discount code, it'll be about £61.20. So
it's a
an
steal.
absolute bargain for W.
Yes, definitely take advantage of that. And there's another reason for that is that moving forward, we will be discontinuing this whiskey as part of the core range. But what we will be doing is always keeping it around, shock horror, and it will become an annual release. So I have asked our marketing department, and they told me that I can share some images with you, as long as you promise not to post them on social media just yet. This is just a little bit of a serving suggestion for the standard hedonism, which I'd highly recommend with dark chocolate truffles. It is a delicious way to drink it and pair it for low maintenance dinner party dessert. But yeah, this is essentially what our new hedonism will look like on, I mean, at least for the first year for 2024. It'll be releasing now in February. And the idea being that it is just increasingly challenging for us to make this whiskey as good as we want to make it without having to potentially adjust the price as we go along. Really beautiful grain whiskies that are a little bit older have become a little bit more expensive to procure. So in order to make it as good as we want to make it and give us a little bit of flexibility on pricing as time goes by, we've had to turn it into an annual release. So this will be coming out now in February. There's just over 7,000 bottles being released globally. And the idea is that every single release, because hedonism itself was one of the first ever whiskies to have a woman's image on the label, we've lent into that with these releases now. So we will be getting a different female artist to do a portrait for us for each label. So this one here that you see, the artwork is done by a lady called Stephanie Rue, who is from Edinburgh. And she's created this beautiful gold leaf portrait. And the bottle, we've recently got some into the office, and it is exquisite in person. So I'd definitely recommend having a look at one if you see it up close. That gold leaf is really quite special. But like I say, it's just something we've had to do with just the nature of the industry and how challenging it is to get these older grain whiskies. So we will always have it around, but sadly not as prevalent as you've been used to in the past. So if you fancy hanging on to a few bottles, then definitely hit up the whiskey shop and take a few in and store them in your cupboard for when you're having friends around and feel like enjoying it with some good chocolate.
Well, there you go. I didn't even know that. So that was breaking news for me as well. That's very exciting. And are we supposed to know who this lady is on front of the bottle?
I mean, the lady herself? No,
yeah.
I think it's more just images, or I think she will get models that she will use and then essentially paint the portraits and work on it with gold leaf.
But it's definitely a person. You can put on the record here that Compass Box will never do a hedonism batch with an AI generated human on the front.
I hope not. I doubt it's not really our style. I mean, we really do lean more into the craftsmanship and artwork. So it would be really nice to have proper artists doing proper people. But you know, I'm not in the marketing department, so I can't make any promises.
No, it's a beautiful bottle, and I mean, maybe I'm asking the obvious. How much will there be blend changes from year to year? Are you going to kind of experiment with it, or is it just going to try and stay like this, but just be a bit more limited?
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely will evolve depending on what we can get a hold of. But the idea has always been for us to make sure that it is hedonistic in personality. You know, it's going to be really indulgent and elegance, much like what you've just tasted. I can tell you that from what I've tasted in this new one, it has got some beautiful older Cameron Bridge that we have had our hands on for a little while now. That has actually got quite a decent corn content in the mash bill. So you get this beautiful buttery note that comes through on this this particular release, which I was really blown away by. So it will evolve for sure, but it will also still always represent what it's supposed to, you know, just really indulgent and elegant grain whiskies brought together in a bottle. So yeah.
Well, I must say, I don't know how much the artwork will change year on year as you commission different artists, but looking at that, it fits the visuals fit the flavor profile. What I'm tasting, I'm not sure if the people on the call agree, but it's got that kind of Moorish, rich, goldish, as you say, the creme brulee kind of flavors. I mean, I think I might have said this last time, but so apologies if I did. But the hedonism is in name and nature. It's got that real feel to it, like you want to overindulge with it.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing for us. Is a lot of what we're focused on these days is making sure that that all connects. You know, the name, and the label and the liquid inside of the bottle all need to feel the same, because that's, you know, what people are enjoying, and it feels more authentic when it all comes together like that. So, yeah.
So I don't know. I would love to get people's taste notes and thoughts so far, having sipped this. Craig's got one there, but I must say, one of the things I don't like about grain whiskey normally, which is the exception here, is that I think it lacks a mouthfeel, you know, a presence in the mouth. And I don't know whether it's the actual texture or whether it's just how impressively complex the finish is. But this doesn't, you don't feel that, you know, because I'm very much I need to, with all my single malts or pot stills, I like that real oiliness, the kind of, you want to be able to chew the whiskey as much as drink it. Craig has said quite soft and mellow, both on the nose and in tasting. Scott says, hi, it's very classy, so easy to drink regardless of if it's grain or nor. Marvelous.
Good to hear. I mean, I think one of the things that for me, it's one of the things that we really believe in, which we'll skip over just now in the presentation, but talk about it now, is that we believe in non-chill filtering our whiskies. So we don't chill filter any of our whiskies, because essentially that's going to remove a lot of flavor in the process. But for us, particularly, I find that it removes a lot of texture. And that's something that I really love in the whiskies that we produce, is that it always does have this wonderful mouthfeel. There is a lot of that texture that comes through. So the non-chill filtered whiskies for me make a big difference from that side. We also don't put any coloring inside of any of our whiskies. We would prefer them to be as pure and as delicious as possible without adding anything to the mix.
Yeah. Craig said, I know it's January, but a summer dram for me. I can see where you're going with that, Craig. Personally, I think an after dinner dram, maybe, like, you know.
We've actually
sweet.
I'm reporting to you live from the office here, because if I was at home, my son might be making a lot more noise. He's tends to chirp up at the wrong time. So we actually have a bottle in the freezer currently here at the office, and when you come and visit us at the office, we always pull out a bottle and pour a nice frozen dram of hedonism, and it's just got this beautiful silky texture, lots of viscosity in it, and sort of warms up in the mouth. So quite a lovely way to try it.
Brilliant. Ian says definitely get the vanilla and creme brulee, but also a bit of coconut. That's excellent. So keep the tasty notes coming in, guys. Martin has said, is that an invite, Michael, over to the offices?
I mean, you're welcome to ping us a message. We've just moved to Richmond. We were in Chiswick for probably about 18 years, and we had run out of space to host people and do all sorts of things. So we now, with the move, we've got a lovely new little bar space, and we do have a bigger blending room for John and James to play around in, as well as a tasting room and stuff. So yeah, by all means, drop us a message. hello@compassbox whiskey. We're always happy to receive emails and requests.
If you're now in Richmond, do you go down to any Richmond FC games? You not met Ted Lasso in the local pub now?
No, but I've actually just recently convinced the guys at the Prince's Head, which is the one from the show, to stock. So if you go to the Prince's Head, you can have some hedonism, and they have some peat monster in there at the moment. So, you know, you can go and get your Ted Lasso experience and sip in some Compass Box.
Marvelous. And do they have a darts board in there like in the show?
They don't. They might have one around the corner. I haven't seen. They've set up a few things, but mostly it's pretty much, you know, as you see it. They've got a lot of frame stuff up and one of the scarves and all that kind of stuff. So it does feel really authentic there.
Marvelous. I suppose while people are maybe going to consider any more taste notes before we move on to the next one, because I can see people still sipping away. I've got a small bit left there. You said that the gentleman who started the company, Glaser, was it?
Yeah, John Glaser.
Marvelous. Maybe to tell us a bit more about how that came about. Obviously, you mentioned about the they wanted to launch hedonism, and the kind of state whiskey was in the 90s. I mean, I suppose on that same note, what was he thinking getting involved in whiskey then?
Yeah, so like I say, he had actually started off studying wine. He had studied wine, wanted to get into the world of blending wine, and he said, for one reason or another, he got sucked into the marketing department of a whiskey company. So he started out with United Distillers, which eventually became, as we know today, Diageo. And yeah, was working on the Johnnie Walker portfolio. And I think it was just, you know, he's naturally really curious and loves flavor. I mean, John still will order grapes to his doorstep to try and make some wine at home here in he stays just around the corner in Kew Gardens. So, you know, always trying and being adventurous with all sorts of things. And I think it probably frustrated him to a large degree to see how much potential there was in blended Scotch whiskey and how little was being explored. And I think that just pushed him to a point where he decided that it was time to go and really explore that and kind of see where it could go. And I think, you know, we at Compass Box say that we see blending as a platform for creativity. So it's an opportunity to bring different elements together and create something that's a little bit more complex and interesting. So
Yeah, no,
yeah,
makes sense. And Scott has said he saw you in the whiskey shop Edinburgh, enjoyed the tasting so much, had to sign up for the virtual one. It's great to hear.
awesome.
Scott.
Thank you.
And Martin has said, how did the name Compass Box come about?
So, I mean, there's two stories. There's one that I like to tell, and there's one that John sort of told me. So we can dip into both. I said to John that he always describes whiskey as being in the doldrums when in the 90s, and it's very much a sailing term of, you know, when everything had started to slow down. And in my mind, you know, when a ship's captain was in the doldrums, you'd turn to his compass box, pull out all the equipment, and chart his route out of dodgy waters and find somewhere better to be. John said that sadly that's not the real story. He actually was going to name it something that sounded particularly Irish at first, and his father said to him, "It's probably not a good idea to start a Scotch whiskey company that has a very Irish-sounding name." But he said it is linked to one of his favorite constellations, so it is known as the compass. And then the symbol that you see that we have on the bottles is actually the cooper's compass. So that's what they'll use to measure the heads of the casks when they want to cut them out for making those casks.
Excellent. Although I must say, having been 2 years this month since I moved to Scotland, and everything here and everyone here has an Irish sounding name, but no real connection to Ireland. So it's you know, it's quite a bit of a theme.
Yeah.
Mela said, "Well, that's my first compass box. Must admit, could drink that all night. Just taste the class in that very smooth and rich flavors." Well, Mel, I hope you're ready for your second compass box. So will we move on to the Glasgow blend?
Yep, that's it. We can do that. So Glasgow blend, let me just try and pop it up here quickly.
And while you're popping that up, Catherine says, this is lovely, very light and refreshing. Reminds me of cakes I used to get from Patisserie Valerie.
Yeah, that's a lovely. I do. That pastry cream note for me is just so gorgeous inside of there. It really does speak to something so specific. I think it's amazing how it still shines through. If you add a bit of water to it, a lot of people find that they get a lot of fruits out of hedonism as well, which is really cool. So yeah, Glasgow blend that we're going to try now is one of our blended scotches. So as I was having a look there, obviously you have malt and grain whiskey, then you've got single malt, single grain. We play in the other three categories: blended Scotch, blended malt, and blended grain. So obviously we've just drunk some blended grain whiskey. This is a blended Scotch that we're going to be going on to, which is Glasgow blend. The idea with Glasgow blend is that there is a book called Whiskey by Aeneas MacDonald. And in this book, there was a lot of talk about whiskey sort of in the turn of the 20th century. And one of the things that he listed was the different cities in Scotland and the style of whiskey that they were drinking. And it was just said that Glaswegians were just drinking a much more full-flavored style of whiskey. So the idea with this one is you're looking at sherry as well as peat layered together. So what you'll have here, I mean, a beautiful little bottle. You'll see there it's got the Duke of Wellington on the front with the little cone on his head, which I always quite like. So it's a nod to the city and how it doesn't take itself too seriously. But usually inside of a blended Scotch, what you're getting is sort of 25, maybe 35% malt whiskey. And then the balance will be bulked up with grain. And this, I think, is where a lot of the sort of bad rap for grain came from. Everyone thought it was, you know, this cheap, flavorless stuff that was always added into a blend in order to take up a lot of the bulk. And I mean, if you look at a lot of blends, I mean, a lot of blends don't tend to tell you what goes into the recipes. But I think if you had a look at a lot of them, you'll find that there is quite a fair amount of grain whiskey inside of a lot of them. We like to play on the other side of that, where if you have a look at this breakdown, you'll see that there's 35% Cameron Bridge inside of this blend. And the balance of all the whiskey inside of here is malt, which means you're looking at 65% malt inside of this blend, which is sort of the other side of the coin from what normally happens. And that just means that you're going to get loads more flavor delivery. You're going to get some beautiful texture coming through on this. So here you'll be looking at some lovely Klein Leash. which we like to use for that texture. It's got that lovely sort of waxy creaminess that comes through. You're going to have some sherry cask aged whiskey from the distillery near the town of Avaloa. So I hear you ask me, where is that? So we get told every now and again that we have to be vague about some stuff according to like just purchasing agreements we have with certain distilleries. But the reality is that if people ask us, we are allowed to tell them whatever they like to know. So that there is sherry cask aged whiskey from Craigellachie. So you're going to get those wonderful richer fruits coming through, and then you've got about 18% of the blend being made up from Lefroy. So as I say, you're going to have lovely layers of richer fruit, as well as this beautiful peat notes coming through. Quite a nice sort of big meaty, peaty maritime character, but it's really well integrated for me, which I really love about this blend is that, I say to people, it's almost like if you think of a really high voltage Johnny Walker Black label, if you had to like really turn up the volume on it, I think this is where you'd end up with Glasgow Blend. So this is coming in at 43% ABV. So usually with a blended Scotch, a lot of even single malts these days, they're coming in at 40%. So this is really handy to have in at 43% because I think it does deliver more flavor, more texture. But it does mean that if you are looking to mix this into a cocktail or a highball or something like that, you're going to have a lot more flavor being delivered on the back end of it. So that's always quite an important one for me. I'd highly recommend trying this in a Bobby Burns, which is obviously very suitable for tonight. But it's one of my favorite drinks to drink with Glasgow Blend. So that'll be your whiskey. You've got
Dom Benedictine and sweet vermouth.
Yeah, that's it. And it's just got this rich profile that I find any sort of fortified wine, so port, vermouth, sherry, attaches itself to the sherried components in this whiskey really nicely. And then you get this wonderful wisp of smoke in the background. And my favorite is always that very last sip that you have where you get the cherry in the bottom and the cocktail's gotten like ever so slightly warmer. And then it all sort of comes together in your mouth with that last sip. So highly recommend that.
It's a great cocktail. It's underrated.
Yeah, I try and order it often if I'm out just to jog people's memory, but also just to maybe get them to remember what a great drink it is. And like I say, tonight, perfect night for it. I'll probably mix myself one of them once I'm done here and enjoy it. So
marvelous.
Yeah.
Well, I'll email out a recipe for a good one with the recording on this because for the night that's in it, it is an apt cocktail.
So there's a good question. There's a significant difference in the single marrying cask version of the Glasgow Blend. Yeah, so it's a great question to ask. So what we do when we are creating these whiskies, so for this Glasgow Blend, for example, we will take all those component whiskies that you saw, Clan Leash, Lefroy, the Craigellachie, even the grain elements. We'll bring it all together. We'll empty the casks, and then we will put those into a vat to blend together. And then we will put them back into those component casks as a blend and allow it to marry and integrate inside of those casks. It's obviously an environment that it's very familiar with, and the wood just helps bring everything together. But generally, for most of our whiskies, we will do that for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, just to let it integrate. Every so often, we will do a batch that we call a single marrying cask, where we'll leave that blend inside those casks for an additional year. So what you get is potentially the Glasgow blend sitting inside sherry for even longer, for another year. And what that's going to do is it's going to amplify and emphasize those sherried components. So if you left it in the Lefroy cask, for example, for an extra year, you'd obviously get a little bit more smoke and peat coming through. If you left it inside the grain cask, you'll get a little bit of a different, maybe more vanillas and caramels popping out. So it does. The marrying cask will depend exactly on which cask you pick up. But yeah, they can have quite a nice significant difference. I tasted the latest batch that we sent out this year, and the Glasgow blend in the French oak was gorgeous. And then there was Glasgow blend that was also in the sherry, was also just beautiful. So yeah.
Excellent. We've got a few great comments coming in there. Sorry, I'll go back to the first one. Catherine said, "This is lovely, very light and refreshing. Reminds me of." Oh no, sorry, that's on the on the hedonism. Sorry. Hecky Doyle said, "How that's much nicer. Oh, that's much nicer. Complex and spicy smokiness. Getting white pepper, green cardamom, quite oily and chewy. Is great tasting notes."
Yeah, those are
Craig, and
fantastic.
I agree with Hecky Doyle that this is. It's definitely more complex, spicy, and smokiness, but that's kind of contrasted with what is being said down below by Alistair, who says Peat is Lafroig is a big turn off for them. They can handle this, but just the oil just the L spoils it for me. So yeah, there's some interesting taste notes. Kira said there is a significant difference in the single marrying cask. Sorry, that's the question you just answered.
Yeah.
I better quit while I'm ahead. No, there are great comments in there, folks. I'm actually was doing a dry January until the hedonism, so maybe it's just gone straight to my head.
Yeah, it's playing catch up on you. But no, I mean, these are great questions, and thanks for sharing them. You know what, like it's, I completely understand the peat is one of those things that for some people it is just a bit too much. But what you'll see is as we go through, there is different ways to integrate peat. So I think it's quite interesting, quite a lot of fun. So yeah.
Excellent.
So,
And just on that one, before we move on, I suppose this is £40 on the website. And obviously with the discount code at the end, it's £34. So it's coming in at a really reasonably priced dram. Just a reminder that for everyone, I'm sure most people on the call know this, but obviously W Club members get free shipping. So if you were just to buy this one, you would literally just be paying your £34 straight to your door. Yeah, so
happy days. Yeah.
there you go, folks.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, if you're happy to move ahead, I think I was just going to tell a little bit of a story quickly just to illustrate something that we usually have a conversation about when we talk about blended whiskies. So I think sometimes for me, a lot of people forget or maybe don't think about it all that often is that, you know, single malt distilleries are blending whiskey anyway. They're just doing it under their own roof. So, you know, your favorite single malt distillery's 12-year-old release or whatever it may be is a combination of casks that come from their distillery that they will bring together in order to create that profile for that release that they want. And the way I usually describe it to people is with the majority of single malt distilleries, obviously not all of them, because there are some really creative ones that are coming out that are doing smaller volumes. But with the bigger ones, you're generally got, you know, a setup that they have going from fermentation through to distillation in order to create their new make, because they're trying to optimize it. They're trying to make sure that this is free flowing and that they can run it with as few people as necessary and make sure it has that consistency. And that new make spirit for them is very much their fingerprint. I say to people, it's almost like their opinion of how they make whiskey. You know, it comes from the people that make it, the recipes they've inherited, the areas of Scotland that they are based, all these different factors that make it so unique and so wonderful. And that's what's so great about single malt whiskey, is that it has a bit of a reflection of these distilleries. But as I say, it's that new make that is their character. And then when they put it into wood, it's the type of cask that they age it in, or it is the amount of time that they age it for that's going to deviate it. So I describe it to people a little bit like having 50 shades of the color blue. So you can imagine that, you know, inside your warehouse, you've got some much lighter blues, you've got some much darker blues, but they all sort of share the same DNA because they come from your distillery and come from your new make. So that is really fantastic if you want to paint a picture of the ocean, because you've got beautiful depth and richness to draw from in terms of these different shades of this color. But the challenge comes in is when you want to shift your gaze up and you want to paint the ocean as well as the sunset. And now you don't necessarily from your distillery have access to oranges and reds and these yellows and stuff. And I think that for me is where us as whiskey makers and blenders have the opportunity to draw from different distilleries, and we will bring different elements together, whether it is textural, whether it is a specific flavor profile, whether it is potentially smoke. These kind of things we can bring in and out, and we can do them in different quantities and different elements so that we have, you know, something that is a little bit more creative, I suppose, to draw from. So we can just create pictures that you sometimes can't create out of a single distillery because we have access to different profiles. So just our sort of way of seeing it. So when we say that we see blending as a platform for creativity, that's sort of the viewpoint that we have.
No, that's excellent. And extending that metaphor, would you say blending is hard or easy?
That was very sharp. Yeah, I mean, it is an art form in itself, that's for sure.
Marvelous. Kirsty's got a great comment on the Glasgow blend, saying how much would an Edinburgh blend cost? 5 times the price of Glasgow, 10 times.
Well, we've actually got our artist blend, which I don't have any close to me, but our artist blend is a bit more classic in profile. And that would be Clynelish. There is some sherry cask aged linkwood inside of there, and it's wonderful, beautiful texture on it. It's lovely sort of baked apple fruitiness and a little bit of biscuity spice. So it's, I'd say, a bit more sort of for people who are used to drinking Speyside, I suppose it would be a good analogy. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly the same price. So we haven't offended anyone, hopefully.
Marvelous. So we'll come on to the orchard box. I think Kirsty was more making a joke about how more expensive Edinburgh is than Glasgow, but I'm glad you gave us a good answer on that. But the as we come on to the next one, obviously the Orchard House, we've got another couple of comments in there. Scott has said, I've been fascinated by your link down south with Bimber Distillery with the Duality release. Do you plan to do more with them and or collaborate with any other distilleries?
I mean, I'd have to ask James what's up his sleeve, because I mean, that one, I'd been with the company for a little while at that point, and yeah, it kind of snuck up on me even. So sometimes they can be really covert with a lot of the things that they get up to. But yeah, I think there definitely will be more collaborations in the future. Who it will be, I'm not too sure at this point. But we like to explore and we like to create something new and something interesting. I think the Bimber one had some really interesting challenges. Obviously, bringing Scotch and English whiskies together can create some hiccups from legalities. So we had to navigate all of those waters, and I think it taught us a lot, but it also just maybe opened the door for making future collaborations a little bit easier. So, you know, we've gotten to a point where we are lucky enough that we've created quite a good name for ourselves, that people understand what Compass Box is about to a large extent, and that we are somewhat established. So it does become easier to release whiskey that isn't necessarily called Scotch if we feel like doing it. And with the sort of popularity of world whiskey and how big it's gotten and widely recognized and adopted, it does open a lot of doors for that kind of thing. So we don't have to necessarily stay.
Bimber, which is like such a hot brand at the moment.
Yeah, exactly it. And you know what? They are pretty much the closest distillery to us. So it was quite fun to just go down the road and be able to do something with your neighbors.
Well, there you go. I must say, I sometimes call into our auction house. It's a few miles away from our offices, so I don't go all the time, maybe once a week or so. And every now and then there's like a full collection or near to full collection of their tube stop releases on the shelf. And I'm both amazed and jealous. I'll never own one. They look great altogether. But I don't know how much they'd be to collect, a fortune, but yeah.
Yeah, they get snapped up quite quickly.
So there's a couple more comments that I will come back to in there, but I think we may be good to start on the Orchard House first.
Yes. Yeah, let's move along to Orchard House. So share that across for you. So Orchard House for us is the latest in our core range. And the idea behind this whiskey is that, as it says, they're quite fruit forward and sort of spirit driven. So generally, a lot of our whiskey tends to be, and I suppose most whiskey in general tends to be quite cask driven. So it's a lot of the wood influence that's really bringing most of the presence to the table. This whiskey showcases a lot of distillery character, which is what I really love about it. And it makes it really interesting and unique in terms of flavor profile. So the best way to go about this, I think, would just to tell you a little bit of a story of how this whiskey came about. So Orchard House is some of the first whiskies that we have started laying down ourselves. So obviously, as not distilling whiskey ourselves, the earliest point we can get involved in the flavor process is being able to take new make and put it into casks that we have procured. So that's what we are doing, is procuring these beautiful first fill casks. We are sending them to these distilleries that we really loved working with, and ones that we thought were going to be very important for the company moving forward. So you're looking at around about 2010 or so, when you know, we had made a little bit of money and got some cash flow and capital together to allow us to start investing a bit more in this process. So we had approached Clynelish, Linkwood, these sort of distilleries, sent casks to them filled with new make, and then left them to rest. We came to them about 2 to 3 years later to start tasting and nosing them to see how they were evolving. And John, obviously being incredibly familiar with these distilleries, he'd been working with them for quite a while, and also knowing what good first fill would be doing to them, noticed that the flavor profile wasn't quite matching up to what you would expect. So there wasn't as much sort of richness and butterscotch and intensity coming through from these casks. So he went up the ladder a little bit and started doing a bit of investigation. And what he found out, there's a practice that's been happening in bourbon for a number of years called barrel rinsing. And it's not something that's spoken about that broadly, which is interesting. But the idea being that, you know, bourbon industry takes these brand new casks that they've charred, they fill it with whiskey. Once it's aged, they empty the whiskey out. They're not allowed to use them again, so they sell them on to Scotland, Ireland, whoever else is after them. And that, when it arrives on our shores, would be called first fill, the first time you'd use it after being used for bourbon. And what they had figured out is that once they had dumped the bourbon, they could actually fill the casks back up with water, give them a shake and leave them out in the sun, and it would actually leach the remaining alcohol out the wood. So you would be getting somewhere between 2 to 3 liters of extra alcohol per cask, which, if you think of the thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of casks that they are producing, makes up quite a lot. So obviously this, for the accountants, was fantastic news. They were like, you know, we suddenly have access to a lot more alcohol, a lot more profit margin. And what they would do is use that sort of whiskey tinged water to then cut their whiskey down to bottling strength, essentially. So that's great for them. The challenge comes in is that, you know, anyone else who's procuring these casks down the line, unless they're being informed of it, so suddenly getting a cask that's acting a little bit more like a refill instead of acting as intensely as a first fill. So it's a little bit of that activity in that wood. So we had whiskey that wasn't necessarily bringing a lot of that butterscotch and richness to the table, but it was actually James who turned around to John and said, you know, it's not doing exactly what we expected, but it is giving us something that we didn't have access to before. And this is this beautiful, bright sort of distillery character coming through, and lovely, softer, lighter fruit that hadn't been overpowered by the wood yet. So he said, you know, let's try and lean into this and see if we can create something really interesting out of this. And that's what they did. So Orchard House was born out of an opportunity, essentially, that we had to suddenly start making a slightly different style of whiskey that we probably wouldn't have had access to making before. So if you have a look at this breakdown, this is the latest batch. I don't know which one you guys currently have in front of you, but I've got the 2023 with me, so I thought I'd pop this one up. As I say, if you go into the website, the core range is all available by batch. So you will be able to pull off the one according to the bottling that you have with you. And you'll see that predominantly inside of here, you're looking at like 40% liquid. You're looking at about just short of 40, I think it's about 39% Klein Leash if you add up the different casks. And that's going to form your backbone. You've got almost 80% of this blend that is going to have these beautiful sort of pear, apple, citrus notes that are coming through. And you'll get that straight off the nose on this whiskey. So lovely pear and apple. You might get hints of tropical fruit coming through too. You definitely get a lovely sort of citrus, lemon and lime zest. I get almost like an Earl Grey tea, like a bergamot note that comes off of it. It also carries through. If you go into the palates of this, you'll notice that it is equally as bright and juicy and fruity on the palate, which I think is quite surprising for a lot of people. They don't necessarily expect Scotch to be that bright and juicy. So it is a lovely surprise, and it makes it quite accessible and drinkable in a number of different ways. So Orchard House is a blended malt, so a blend of only single malts, coming in at 46%, which I think is quite interesting because it doesn't necessarily feel like it on the palate. It is still really approachable. I mean, you definitely still have some lovely cask influence, so you do get some like vanillas and caramels that will still be in there. It's just not going to be as overpowering as it normally would. And it is a whiskey that is beautiful on its own. It pairs really well with cheese if you want to try it with some good cheese and some fresh fruit. It cuts, I find like the brightness of the whiskey cuts through the cheese really nicely. It also makes a fantastic highball. So, you know, nice and refreshing on a lovely hot day. It also pairs next to some really good cider. If you do have some good cider, I'd highly recommend, you know, a little bit of cider and whiskey side by side is super delicious. But it also, for me, is is a wonderful look inside the mind of a whiskey maker too, when you have a look at this blending wheel, because you'll see that there's stuff in there that is a little bit more unusual than what you might not necessarily expect out of a whiskey that tastes the way it does. So if you look, you've got, like I say, you've got the liquid, which is 40%. You've got about 40% of Clynelish inside of there. So that quite clearly the backbone with that sort of fresh fruits and orchard fruits, a little bit of sort of honey and waxiness that comes through. But then you'll also have that distillery near the town of Barbara, the same one we were speaking about earlier, so sherry cask aged Craigellachie. And that's going to bring some lovely sort of deeper, richer red apple, toffee apple, sultana notes, but definitely an accent. So it's there to create depth and some complexity. Because if you just mixed liquid and Clynelish together, it would be gorgeous, but it wouldn't necessarily have the quality that we're looking for, which is that ability to draw you back to the glass and say, hey, hang on, there's something a little bit more interesting going in here that I want to go and explore a little bit further. And then you will also see something in there that a lot of people probably wouldn't have expected, which is the Caol Ila. So there's 2%, 2.1% inside of this blend. And that is, once again, it's in there to create something interesting and some wonderful complexity inside of the blend. So it's I usually describe it to people with Orchard House. If you think of like a meadow and you've got these beautiful sort of flowers and you've got these orchard trees, that would be sort of the base of what your blend is being made up of. And for me, the Caol Ila is almost like a little bee. So it's buzzing around and it's creating authenticity to the whole picture, but it's not the star of the show and it's not getting in the way. Unless you didn't have any bugs in this meadow, it would feel really weird and it wouldn't really connect. And I think that that's it. It just brings this authenticity together and gives it some complexity.
That's good. It's bringing the picture together while also scaring the picnickers off, you know.
Yeah, it's giving you the meadow all to yourself.
It is incredibly complex. I was brilliant, but when I first tasted it, I was thinking along the lines of was it Alistair was saying apples galore, and I was kind of, maybe it's the name and the way the label looks. There's almost a psychological element where you think, oh, this is going to be, I know what this is going to taste like. It's going to be fairly nice but one-dimensional. But as you go on, it actually opens up really, really nicely. We've got a comment in there saying pear drops as well, which is great. No, it's a really good whiskey, an interesting blend. I always think we used to run the Irish whiskey experience back in a former life, and we used to have a blending school where you blend your own whiskey. And I would always recommend people, even if they couldn't stand the peat, I'd be like, add just a touch of peat.
Yeah.
Watch, it'll open up your whiskey. It'll make it more complex. It elongates that finish. But most people you give it a sample of your little blend to won't even notice that there's peat in there, but it will change it for the better. So it works really well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is what James described to me. He said that they knew they needed something in the blend, and they started at about 5%, and then they worked their way down eventually to about 2.5, depending on the batch. But we've done some sample tastings called our Orchard House blending sessions, where we take 4 of the components and we break them down on a tasting mat, and you'll taste liquid, Clynelish, the Craigellachie, and the Caol Ila all at new make, and then it matured, to show you what we started with and how we matured it and how it evolved. And it's fascinating because you see where there's some of these flavor profiles will start off and what the new make has present, and then how it evolves with the wood. And for me, that Caol Ila starts with this beautiful, sweet, ashy smoke. I mean, their new make is fantastic. It's I reckon would give really good mezcal a run for its money. That's how good it is. And it is definitely that sort of sweet after a fire. Somebody described it yesterday, which was mildly terrifying. They were like, it smells like a room that a fire has been in and then it's gone. And it was like a little bit like a ghost of a fire. So it's not that intense sort of bonfire, meaty peatiness. And it mellows out with the wood to become almost like a smoked almond. So it's got this lovely soft smoked nuttiness. And I think that's why it works so well in this blend. If we had to use an Ardbeg or a Lefroy or something, I think it would just be too powerful and too dominant. So it really is about selecting, the right whiskies at the right point in order to make these lovely accents.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's excellent. And maybe along those lines, we could jump back to Mel's question, who says, do you ever do a blend and say no? So that was my attempt at like an Ian Paisley.
Yeah.
Ulster said
yeah,
no,
definitely.
but I couldn't pull it off.
there's been many along the way that I'm sure have been shelved. I mean, I've looked in the blending room and seen boxes. You know, James has these little plastic boxes that are Perspex boxes with all the different cast samples in them, and there's names on there that I've never seen on our back bar. So it means that there's a couple of them that reached a certain point before they just turned around and said it's not making any sense or it doesn't quite work. You know, we'll go through a couple of different variations of each of the blends before they come to light. So trial and error is definitely there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the way blends are orchestrated in the way you're describing, that's totally possible. I suppose Mel, but just on the kind of way they expand that question, which I didn't read that out, it was my fault, was they were saying after you've married the cask, and then so I suppose with that progressive blending, that stuff you were talking about earlier on with the Glasgow blend, where you're kind of taking a blend, marrying it into a cask, and then have you ever gone to that point and been like, no, this isn't working?
No, not as far as I'm aware. I mean, I think the idea is that, you know, it's already going to have elements inside of that blend anyway when it's been in the marrying process. So all you're going to be doing is maybe just extracting a little bit more of certain profiles. It's not necessarily, I mean, it's only an extra year finishing, so it's not something that would completely overpower the original blend. It's more just enhancing certain elements of it.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Brilliant. Well, thank you for the question, Mel. That's a good one. Who's also said that's the third Compass box, and can honestly say impressed. You got me as a new customer. So there you go.
Happy days. Yeah, that's good to hear.
So maybe we'll come on to the next one, which is, what was it, the Spaniard?
Yep, the story of the Spaniard. So the story of the Spaniard is, I describe to people a little bit like the other side of the coin to Orchard House. So Orchard House, a little bit more sort of spirit driven, lovely brighter fruits as we've just gone through. Story of the Spaniard is a lot richer fruit, and all about the cask influence. So this is Spanish sherry cask predominantly. The idea being that John, as I said, massive fan of wine, and when he was a younger man, went to Spain and was taken aside by some of the locals and shown this wonderful world of sherry that he hadn't explored before, and was obviously quite blown away by the complexity and how interesting it is and how many different varied styles there are, and all this immense flavor that it had to offer. So he had very fond memories of this, and you know, this is a bit of a nod to that journey that he went on, and that's it, trying to lean into beautiful sherry cask aged whiskey. So I'll share just so you can see the breakdowns of it. It is a little bit more complex, this one, you'll find, than some of the ones that you've seen before. Some lovely Orchard House highballs for you. We'll jump back onto that now. So this is the wheel. You'll see that the batch number for this will be quite, this is the most recent one, I think, 2022A. This predominantly sherry cask, you're going to have a little bit of our custom French oak cask aged whiskey, which we'll also get into now. We'll have a little bit of a chat about. There's a little bit of first fill bourbon, and there's some remnants of our previous batch of the story of the Spaniard. It is, so this, just to go through the flavor profile briefly, for me, this is berries, cherries, plums, lovely raisiny notes. You're going to get a bit of structure on the back end, so a lovely sort of spice, wood spice that comes through on the back, which will come from our Highland malt blend. So lovely, rounded and complex. I always say to people that it's not a cask strength sherry bomb that you're going to have to wrestle with. So this is 43%. It's beautifully drinkable. It's got all the elements of sherry cask aged whiskey that you want, that lovely richness. And I say it's like sitting down in like one of your favorite armchairs, and it just sort of envelops you and makes you feel very comfortable immediately. So it's quite a handy whiskey to have in the cupboard, because it's usually around about £55 a bottle. Obviously tonight it's going for a stellar price, but you know, it's one that you can turn to quite frequently, and you're just going to tick a lot of boxes with it.
Yeah, marvelous. On that blend there, the Macduff distillery, I'm not over familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, it was one that I hadn't come across a lot either, to be honest with you, but it is one that we seem to have used in a couple limited editions as well. So yeah, James has managed to find these samples out of somewhere, and yeah, beautiful notes that it brings to the table, which is yeah, I think gives them quite a lot to work with.
Marvelous. No, that's excellent.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, beyond the story you were saying about the wine and the sherry influence, is there any other, you know, the Spaniard it's such an evocative title, like, you know, there's no other kind of story outside of the actual spirit that links to the
I
name?
mean, yeah, so we actually originally, so I can actually show you here because I'm sitting in front of our wall of whiskey. We originally did a bespoke bottling in 2018, which is when about the time we would have released the story of the Spaniard. And this bespoke bottling was called the Spaniard. And it was actually created for the Spaniard, which is a restaurant in the West Village of New York City. And we would have had a chat to the owners there, and I think they were obviously supporters of ours. And we made a 360 bottle run of essentially, I think, the beginning stages of what the story of the Spaniard would have been. You know, a beautiful sherry cask aged whiskey, lovely structure to it that we wanted to be able to use for pairing with lovely tapas style foods and Spanish meats and cheeses and this kind of thing. So it's I think is where yeah, the start of the story of the Spaniard would be coming from.
Marvelous. There used to be this, what I've recently found out is apocryphal tale is in the west of Ireland, and my father is definitely one of these people. There's a bunch of people who have very sallow skin, like really dark. Like you saw my father in the summer after the sun's out. Looks like you would think he was Spanish or Southern European, or not even North African. You wouldn't it doesn't look like he's related to me because I haven't inherited any of this. But the story always was that there was this from the time of the Spanish Armada, well, not just the Spanish Armada, but the 9 Years' War, Tyrone's rebellion. You have the Spanish land in Dingle initially to try and fight off the English from Ireland, and then the Spanish Armada, a load of Marder ships crash along the west coast of Ireland from Donegal down to Clare. And a lot of them, the Spanish, we have accounts of them staying and some of them traveling through Ireland to get back to Spain. And then they land in Kinsale famously in 1601, and finally get defeated again by the English. And the legend had it was that and this was not just within my family, but you still hear it all the time in Ireland, that people from Donegal down to Kerry, where I'm from, have sallow skin because they go back 400 years and they're related to these Spaniards who landed in Ireland. And with all these 23andMe and DNA tests that have come out recently, it's just that people have been able to find no actual link. So it's now been it's not true, never happened. But for literally, I'd say a couple of 100 years or more, people have been sharing the story, being like, "Oh, I'm sallow because Spanish Armada."
Yeah. I mean, this is the trouble when you let the truth get in the way of a good story. So
No,
yeah.
it definitely is.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a very boring digression, but we go back to what people are actually saying. So Catherine says, reminds me of prunes, that sort of thick, sticky flavor texture, really delicious. Craig says, almost like a dessert wine. Hecky says, yeah, that's just that. Yep, that just too slow. This is the one for me. Says Jeff, has everything I want from a whiskey. Alistair says, this is bad. Just decided to spend a load on upgrading our den with a bar and games, and now I have to spend more. This puts a lot of single malts to shame. Love it. Well, if you're trying to be shifty, Alistair, getting not shifty, thrifty is what I meant to say. Getting the discounted whiskies here on the tasting is the way to go. We've also got a question with what's the TSOTS 2021-A 7.3 the blend.
So that's a good question. So if you have a look, I'll just share this again quickly so you can have a look. If you look at the top left-hand corner there, you'll see the batch is TS 2022A. So that's the current batch. TS 2021 A would have been the previous year. So the batch from the previous year. So that would have been remnants of that previous batch. So, essentially it already had, I mean, you can think of it slightly like a sourdough starter, if you will. It already has the personality of that whiskey that we could use as an element in the blend, and we had some of that stock, so we may as well incorporate it into the next batch. And we have done that in the past with a number of different releases. Sometimes you'll see some of our limited editions have got remnants from previous limited editions or other whiskies. And it's just because essentially we have created a flavor profile that we can now use in order to enhance another blend, which is quite cool. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's quite interesting because the batch numbers, if you go back far enough, and I was just running around in the last year in 2023 to a number of the different whiskey shops, which was a lovely experience to come and meet a lot of these people in person and spend some time and share some drams. But I noticed that in a couple of the stores, they had some of our previous batches of Story of the Spaniard, which is quite fun to pick up if you can, because historically, the Story of the Spaniard had Spanish red wine cask influence, and it would have brought this beautiful sort of tannin and backbone to it that sort of played really well with the sherry component, so that you'd have the richness from the sherry, you'd have the lovely structure from the Spanish red wine. So if you ever see sort of 2018, 2019 batches, it's always worthwhile looking on the back of the bottle, because those are lovely ones. I mean, you'll pay the same price for it, but it's nice to have them side by side to be able to compare and see how, the blends do evolve slightly from time to time.
It's almost a nod to that kind of the Solero system of the sherries as well. Like,
yeah, that's
so
it.
Nice homage and a good way to get rid of slow moving batches. The last bit was a joke, obviously. The Hecky has said first time adding a drop of water made it significantly worse. I think there's some of the questions I haven't deliberately ignored you folks, any of you. It's just when they're coming in, sometimes it's hard to get to them all. But he said that because a few people have said that, how adding water has changed these whiskies so far. But he said this one made it significantly worse. Glad using 2 glasses. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good note to make. I mean, so this is what I say is, the other whiskies in our blended malts out of the core range, so Orchard House, Peat Monster, and Spice Tree, all coming in at 46%. So they've got a little bit more body to them in terms of a little bit more alcohol to work with. It's going to carry a little bit more flavor. I find that the Story of the Spaniard at 43% is just perfectly drinkable where it is. I mean, you obviously are welcome to try and mix it and add and water, etc., etc. We encourage people to try it out and see what they think. But that's, like I say, it's not going to be coming in like a lot of sherry cask aged whiskies where it is, often 50s, 60s sometimes, and you often are needing to have some water very close by, because it can become quite challenging to drink them regularly at that kind of ABV. This one, straight out the gate, is going to be quite approachable at the ABV it's at. So, yeah, I mean, definitely experiment, but it's sometimes for better, sometimes for worse.
Yeah, no, definitely. Excellent. Well, I will tell you now quickly how much that was again, as I did with the last 2. So it's 55 to start with. How good's your maths? I'm gonna bring it up here. What's 15% off that, Michael?
You are looking at 7, almost 8 quid, I suppose. Is that right?
46.75. Yeah. So yeah, 8.25 off that. So it's not bad.
Good job. Yeah. So I mean, that's a cracking price. And like I say, I mean, you'll struggle to find beautiful sherry cask aged whiskey that drinkable at that kind of price point, which is, makes it extra delicious and approachable. So, I mean, if you'll allow me to just quickly indulge before we head on to the final whiskey, just because it is something quite fun to have a conversation about, and it does give you a little bit of insight into a lot of what we do at Compass Box. So this here is some pictures of our custom French oak hybrid casks that we make. So if you've ever tried Spice Tree, it was a whiskey that was quite a monumental release for us in a lot of ways, because it gave us quite a lot of notoriety, but it also created something really interesting for us. So when we were looking to make Spice Tree, John was having a chat at the time to the late Dr. Jim Swan, who he used to work with and was obviously really knowledgeable about the world of whiskey and especially maturation. And he was asking him about trying to find different flavor profiles. So he said that, generally we are looking at American oak ex-bourbon casks or European oak, predominantly ex-sherry casks that we're using, and that's where flavor's coming from. Where else was going to be looking in order to bring more flavor profile to the table that we maybe couldn't find elsewhere? So Jim said to him that he should go look in the Vosges region of France. There was a group of guys making these beautiful French oak staves out of 195-year-old forests. So off John went and had a look. And that's it. They were making these beautiful staves. They were toasting them as opposed to charring them. So, generally that char is going to give you extra texture in the wood for whiskey to interact with. It's also going to give you something to help filter out a lot of the intensity and impurities out of the new make spirit. But it's that layer of toast behind that char where the wood has got a lot of the flavor being activated. So by toasting these casks, they were immediately activating the wood. And we were taking these staves and using a technique that you would have found in winemaking, essentially, is inserting them into the cask as an additional stave inside the cask. And what you're getting is this beautiful spicy profile. So cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, ginger, lovely warming spice. Scottish Whisky Association was slightly less enthusiastic about this technique that we were using, as they said it didn't form part of traditional whiskey making methods. They say that it has to be the heads, hoops, and the staves, and those are the only three components you're allowed to have in a cask. We had a couple conversations with them about him, asking them when whiskey making tradition was written into law so that we could go back and just reference it. And the earliest that we could find was actually in the 1980s at some point when EU and UK law merged. So not incredibly traditional in terms of the actual law, but we agreed to adjust the technique in order to make it work for us and make it fit within the rules. So what you'll see there in the top right is those are the staves getting shipped to us as they come. We do 3 different toast levels, so a light, medium, and a heavy toast. And we will then cut those staves to shape, as you'll see in the bottom right-hand side there. And then those will get attached to the inside of the heads. And those heads will then be attached to the cask. So you have essentially this hybrid cask. It's a bit of a combination of American oak as well as the toasted French oak on the heads. And this gives us access to that profile without contravening the laws, which is quite handy to have. And it's quite an interesting process because when we created that in 2005, it wasn't something that was widely done at all. We were essentially pioneering that technique, and ever since then, it's become quite popular. So if you read Dave Broom's latest book called The Sense of Place, beautiful book, really lovely stories inside of it that he tells of the world of whiskey in Scotland. He reckons that at the Speyside cooperage, which you saw a picture of there, where we get our casks made, they're doing probably about 60% of production at the moment is hybrid casks. And that's not just for us, obviously. That's a lot of the other industry getting involved. They have a program now where apparently you can select almost 300 different combinations. So fascinating to see how it is becoming quite widely adopted. And even I've seen it jump over into the world of tequila, to be honest with you. Patron have released a tequila that describes American oak with toasted French oak heads as the cask that they use. So fascinating to see how people have adopted these ideas. But the way that I usually describe it is what it gave us access to was our own sort of flavor profile. So we create what we call our Highland malt blend, which you might see popping up in some of those recipes. And the Highland malt blend for us since 2021 has essentially been Tomatin, Balmanac, and Glenmurray. We will blend those Highland single malts together and then finish them in these custom French oak casks. And that gives us, I say, almost like a master stock in a way. So we've got this beautiful flavor profile that we can use in some of the other whiskies. And sometimes it is to be a bit more predominant. So you'll get a fair amount of it in the story of the Spaniard that gives it that structure on the back end. It's got a lovely spice on the back end of like the artist blend, for example. And then we'll use it in much smaller quantities in something like Orchard House, where you see it's like 2, maybe 2.4%. And that's just going to help bring the other whiskies together. It seems to be almost a little bit like glue in a way inside of a blend. It really does bridge the gap between whiskies. And when we get into the Peat Monster now, you'll actually see that there's 1% inside of that blend. And I think it plays quite a crucial role, even though it is such a small component. So yeah, just something quite interesting to have a look into.
No, that is very interesting. It's interesting what you say about other brands following you. I mean, we did have the Spice Tree on the last time you were on back in 2022. I think it was the last time I tried it. It was a really interesting whiskey. And I love that idea. I know people who put old cask chips in glass bottles of Pachin or new make, moonshine to add it a bit of color and flavor just in their own pantries or whatever. So it's interesting. It reminded me of that straight away when you said it. And it's interesting that they clamped down on it, the Scottish Whisky Association, and you have that now. You have the tequila industry sort of trying to follow you, because obviously cask aging is not a thing historically in tequila or mezcal. It's a post Second World War invention to try and sell this clear spirit into a market that was used to consuming brown spirits in America. So it's it's fascinating that they're now using your techniques or techniques that were pioneered by you. I suppose I imagine you weren't the first ones to use different staves in a cask, but definitely a massive influence on it. Have you any idea who was the first one to try and play with that, or do you think you definitely were the first?
I mean, as far as I understand, for the hybrid casks, I think it was something that we were really getting into, because you see, everyone else was allowed to do it in other ways. So if you look at the wine industry, they were allowed to add wood chips or staves into the casks. If you look at American whiskey industry, for example, Maker's 46 is still made by inserting staves in the cask. they're still allowed to do it because it is by law. It's something that they can still do. So, you know, for us, we were dealing with different restrictions, and it meant that we had to be more creative. So as far as I have understood, I mean, I could be proven wrong, and I'd be happy to learn otherwise. I think we are one of the ones that that really did pioneer that whole idea. And
yeah, no, it's quite possible. I mean, the reason I mean, definitely pioneered it in terms of as a practice now, but the reason I was saying you was hesitant, you were the first to do it, is because you know, when you visit the space out at Cooperage, you realize that for years people have been repairing casks and stuff with bits of other casks that were lying about. So the idea of a cask containing different staves from different types of barrels is just I imagine it has happened just by
yeah,
by happenstance hundreds of times or thousands of times over the last hundreds of years, you know.
yeah.
But yeah,
Well, I mean,
but
even if you look at the industry at the moment, you know, it was only a short while ago that they realized that, you know, Chinkapin and standard American oak was two different things. I mean, they've been using it for years, and they just always thought they were just magical casks that were doing something different. And, you know, I think that's the fascinating thing with whiskey, is there's still so much to discover and explore, especially with, you know, living products that have organic compounds.
yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And Graham agrees in the chat. So yeah, hopefully his favorite part of the night. Because it's definitely, you know, that's what I come from. I'm one of those whiskey geeks. Come
Yeah.
for the whiskey geekery. Stay for my bad puns.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I suppose no, that's perfect time to come on to Peat Monster, I suppose. Michael.
Yeah, let's do that. So
Did I
yeah,
say did I
final.
tell everyone the price of that last one? Sorry. I did, didn't I?
Yes,
55 down
yes,
to
we did.
47 or 46.75. Yeah, my apologies.
That's correct. Yeah. So the final whiskey we will try this evening is the Peat Monster. So the Peat Monster started for us in 2003. And the idea being, John was having a chat to the team from the Park Avenue liquor store in New York. And at the time, you obviously had, in the early 2000s, you obviously had single malt that was being produced that was peated. So Lafroig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, all of these distilleries were around making beautiful peated whiskey. And you had peated whiskey inside of blends. So, you know, Johnny Walker Black Label, for example, as well as most of the rest of the range, you would definitely have had a peated element to it. But there was nothing sort of peat forward in terms of a blend on the market. And this was something that John wanted to explore. So if you think about it now, you would have stuff like the Big Peat, Smokehead, elements of Isla, all these different whiskies that are around. But before Peat Monster came around, they weren't all around. This was something that sort of hadn't really been explored at the time. So John wanted to bring different peated whiskies together and create a blend that sort of used different elements from different island and smoky distilleries and see what they could bring to the table. So the guys from the Park Avenue liquor store were really keen on this. They said, sure, you know, started sending cast samples back and forth of blends. And eventually John sent one, and on it he wrote, "This one's a monster. Let me know what you think." And the guys were like, "Yeah, this is great. What are we going to call it?" And he said, "Well, I think the name might be on the label." So the original whiskey was called the Peat Monster, with a lot more emphasis on the monster. And I happen to be sitting next to one of the original bottlings, so that's really cool that you can have a look at. That's what it would have looked like back in the day. We had that beautiful monster, which was actually a woodcut that we had access to, that was out of trademark and wasn't affiliated to anything, so it was nice to be able to use it nice and freely. And John had been drinking, you know, some wonderful beers in the US called like the Hop Devil and stuff like this. So, you know, that play on Peat Monster really appealed to him. So Peat Monster was eventually incorporated into the core range after it was the bespoke whiskey that we started with. And I say to people that while we sort of picked off the peated arms rates in a way by you know, making something that was a little bit different back in the day, we haven't kept trying to run that race. So when you're looking at the Ardbegs and the Octomores and stuff that's really trying to push those levels of peat, for me, Peat Monster is a little bit different because it's peat but done with elegance. So it just brings something slightly different to the table. So this here, if you have a look at the recipe, 35% of this blend is going to be Lafroig. So for anyone who's not a fan of Lafroig, just to give you a heads up straight out the gate. But what I find so fascinating is that it starts off with that on the nose. So for me, you get that beautiful, big, meaty, peaty, sort of coastal influence on the nose, and it comes at you quite full on. And what you're expecting off of the back of that is that it's going to be quite ashy and charred and intense on the palate. But as you can see, the balance of that whiskey there is predominantly your Kalila. So 65% of the, or 64%, I suppose, of that blend will be Kalila. And that's going to bring this beautiful sort of fruity creaminess on the palate, as well as obviously having that smoked element there. But it just presents so different on the palate from what you would expect on the nose. And I find that so fascinating about this whiskey. And it just, I don't know. I mean, people say that sometimes the name is a bit misleading for them, but I think it works so well because for me, your monsters are always so intimidating until you confront them, and then you realize that they're actually not as scary as you thought they were. So it's the same way with this, you know, on the nose, it's there to sort of scare you away with its bark. But once you get into the bites of it, it's actually a lot more enjoyable and palatable, and it's got a lot more complexity than you'd actually expect, instead of just being, you know, sort of a harsh slap in the face, as some of them say.
Yeah, Alistair says it doesn't smack me with TCP as most Isle of Peat, which is good. I'm glad you're still here typing that, Alistair, because as soon as you mentioned the word Lefroy, I thought I was going to see a little pop up saying, you know, Alistair's left the chat.
Swift exit. Yeah, so it's I mean, coming in at 46%, 46%. It is a blended malt, as you see, pretty much 2 distilleries and then 1% of that Highland malt blend. And as I say, I think it brings the 2 whiskies together. It's sort of a mediator that bridges the gap between the 2 of them. And it is fantastically drinkable on its own. It is one of those ones. So like for me, if I have a really big peated whiskey, you know, 2 drams, and you're probably losing a lot of sensation in your palate, and it starts to get a bit blurry after that. Whereas this one I find doesn't compound. So every time you have another dram, it's not going to, like, you know, keep growing and growing and growing. It stays quite consistent on the palate. So it's this beautiful, smooth smoke draw along with that complexity. It makes it really interesting. So obviously stuff like blue cheese is a great accompaniment to this. Your seafoods and oysters and that kind of stuff would work really well. But it does work fantastically well in a load of other drinks. So this is a lovely highball that they do at Blackrock in London. So a lovely whiskey bar. If anyone's ever been there before, highly recommend it. And they've gone and got, there's actually some peat monster inside of here, some lychee, and then some soda. And then they've got those lovely little chia seeds that when you soak them, start to pop out like that. They look like little eyeballs floating in the drink, but they're quite fun to drink. So yeah, I mean, there's a number of different ways to try it. If you've never tried a penicillin, or if you have tried one before, obviously a fantastic drink. And the Peat Monster was actually the original peated element inside of penicillin. So John would have gone and dropped off samples of some of our whiskies with Sam Ross, an Australian bartender who was working at Milk and Honey in New York. And when he dropped off the samples, that's where the penicillin was created. So we have a long history with the cocktail industry from that sort of angle.
Really?
And a fantastic way to try that whiskey.
Wow, it's one of my favorite cocktails. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, my manager Karen used to work for, you know, the Milk and Honey. She used to work at PDT, so knows a lot of these people firsthand. I mean, that's where she would have first met John, is when he came in and started trying to convince these beautiful bars to start selling his lovely whiskeys. So.
Well, spoiler alert for W Club members on here, for the next Whiskeria, I'm doing the mixing it up cocktail section. I'm the mixologist for it. I'm doing a take on a penicillin, a Lochfine whiskey take on the penicillin.
Nice.
And so I just happened only the other week to be just reading up on the kind of story, because I've always loved that cocktail for years. And I was like, I assumed for ages that it was one of these classic cocktails that goes back years.
Yeah.
And you look it up, and everyone online, I invented in 2004 in New York. You're like, what? It's like 20 years old.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's amazing. So I didn't and then I didn't really expect a link to be coming back to this tasting tonight. So there you go, Michael. That's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sam Ross is a fantastic bartender. He's created a lot of modern day classics. So if you look at stuff like the Paper Plane and a couple other ones, he's created them. So yeah, quite prolific in terms of getting into cocktail lore. So he's always a good one to follow. Still, you know, running Attaboy in New York and still doing very well.
Brilliant.
I saw a great comment that popped up there, which is one that to be honest, I get quite frequently at a lot of whiskey shows and tastings, which is, I'm not normally a pizza drinker, but I could drink that. I quite enjoyed that. So it is a good one for me for that reason. I love recommending it to people who are on the fence about peat or looking to get into the category. It is a great way to just, you know, get a taste of what it's about without being bashed around the tongue for, you know, for hours on end by intense meaty peatiness.
Well, it definitely has that meatiness though to it. Like,
Yeah.
I was going to say that it's a cliche when it comes to peated whiskies. People who do these tastings regularly probably sick of hearing me say this tasting of, but it's got that kind of smoky bacon finish as well, though it is there. But yeah, it's gorgeous, and I agree with Christian as well, though, and it's a good point you're making there, Michael. And it says, I'm joking, it's not a bottle I'll buy, but it's drinkable for me, which is a thumbs up. So brilliant. Wouter liked the cocktails, so yeah, come for the whiskey, stay for the cocktails, mate. Alice says, even though ever thought, sorry, about doing a peat based on Highland peat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was something that we would love to explore. It was quite interesting because when we did the Bimber release, that's sort of how it came through from one of the releases, because we did 2 simultaneous releases. We released our version of Duality, they released their version of Duality, and our version was a beautiful older Ardbeg that we had blended with a 3-year-old PX sherry cask aged Bimber. And it was a combination of sherry and peat. And then theirs was actually their peated whiskey, which is a lot more like Highland peat because, they have to peat it in a basement that they've created in the owner's house and as a malting floor. And he's jimmied a smoker in order to smoke the peat. So, or to smoke the barley. So it very much comes across a lot more like that. So I think it is something that's really interesting to explore. And it's something that we've been looking at quite a lot recently with, if you've tried any of our Extinct Blends quartet that we've done recently, looking back into older blends from the past, and the way that peat has evolved. So, a lot of the peat that you get these days is quite intense and quite full on and quite aggressive. Whereas a lot of the older styles of peat used to be a lot softer, more like damp bonfire that came through. So it is something that we definitely have been playing around with in some of our creations. And I think it's really interesting to see because whiskey does evolve and profiles change. The product that people get access to does change. So it is sometimes nice to be able to take a look back. I mean, we've picked up a bunch of old blends. We had a 1960s bottling of a really lovely blend that we picked up the other day, and it's fascinating to see how different the whiskeys were back then.
Yeah, no, it's for an industry that prides itself so much in tradition and consistency and homogeneizing these old styles. Whiskey now is nothing like whiskey even in the 90s. It's just it's changed so much. You don't, the way stills were powered, the kind of management of barley and malt and cross contamination and cask management. There's old whiskeys are so much more sulfuric. There's just it's just a different world. Like, if you landed one of these whiskeys, if you could take one of these back in time and give it to someone in the 1960s drink whiskey, he'd be like, what the hell is this? This doesn't taste like the Scotch I drink. So, and I love that the story and tradition and what brought us here today, but also I think we can be a bit too reverential towards it, considering we drink something so entirely different,
Yeah, that's it. And I mean, I think it's just good to keep asking the questions, I think that's what I say to people is, we don't tell people how to drink whiskey. We like to let our whiskey ask a lot of questions for them. And then they can think about their whiskey and decide, is this something that they like, the direction it's going in, or, can we do things differently? And you'll see that with a lot of it, can we present grain whiskey as its own thing? Can we make peated blends that are peat forward? Can we make whiskey that's a lot more bright and fruity? These are conversations that we like to have, and it gets us excited. And it is about just, we see ourselves as, I always say to people, sometimes it comes across like we're not a fan of the Scottish Whisky Association. We definitely are very, very fond of them because they obviously bring a lot of structure and order to an industry that could get quite chaotic, as we've seen with some of the other whiskey industries. But we see ourselves as the ones there to try and make sure that the conversation keeps moving forward. So trying to be able to innovate and create different ways of thinking so that Scotch always stays relevant and that it is something that people are always going to be interested in. And we take that responsibility quite seriously.
There's a balance to be struck because as much as it's not just about, like, I suppose one of the reasons why they're so important as an association, why following the rules is so important, is not just for protecting that heritage, but also for protecting it as an export product, as something that's recognizable around the world. It keeps consistency. There's a reason why, there's so many different reasons why it's important that we have these rules and regulations. I suppose it's also a bit about just about kind of pushing at the edges and see where we can improve without trying to do too much. I mean, I was at Inchjourney Distillery recently. They released the Rye Law last year, their inaugural release, and it's a rye whiskey, 100% based off of literally they would say we base this off of an American rye. That's the mash bill we use. That's the style we used. But it's on the shelf as a single grain whiskey because there's no criteria for rye whiskey in Scotland. So yeah, they entered into awards and trying to get it promoted. And people, they had, I think you mentioned David Broom was like, I don't know how I discuss this whiskey because it's entirely unfair on your hedonism tonight.
Yeah.
Compare it to this rye whiskey, but they'll both sit in the shelf as single grains. So yeah, there's definitely ways we can improve. People have already started popping in, which we always do at the end of the night, the order of what they preferred. So that's great, guys. Keep them coming. The discount code for everyone that I just put in the chat there a few minutes ago is WS16CB. That'll get you 15% off all these SKUs. You can obviously find them on the website. If you don't want to search them, they're all linked. There's a hyperlink to them all in the original product page that the tasting pack could be purchased from. Before we go back through on everyone's final comments and see what people preferred, Michael, have you anything else you wanted to say before we start finishing up?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you very much. It was just lovely to have everyone on tonight. I know it's a special night in the year for whiskey drinkers, so thank you for sharing it with us, and we love sharing it with you. I mean, one of our mottos at Compass Box is that we say above all, share and enjoy. So it is lovely to be able to do that on a night like this. We also do say, please drink creatively. So that is the idea, is go forth and try these whiskeys in a number of different ways, share them with people and try and, be creative, pair them with lovely foods, pair them with cocktails. I've paired some of these whiskeys with fantastic beers too. So there's definitely nothing off the table from my side that, and I'd love to be able to hear some of those. So please feel free to share them with us if you do come across some really good ones. Yeah, and please, I mean, go out and support your local whiskey shop. It was so fantastic running around in 2023 and seeing the amazing community. I was speaking to Luke about it a little bit earlier, and it's something that makes the whiskey shop so unique, is that all you people do go out and support and arrive at these tasting evenings and, go and share the love and make sure that the teams that are doing all the hard work in all these stores feel so loved and appreciated.
Yeah, well said, Michael. I agree. I'll give you that $5 afterwards for saying that. Dan's order top down 21354. We've got Udo says beautiful accessible Peat. That's on the reference to the Peat Monster, and I didn't expect to. I suppose that's almost to sum up. I know we've moved on already from the Peat Monster, but based off what you've said and what some people comments are, it's not as much of a monster as we thought it was, I suppose.
I'd say it's like Shrek. It's
it
it's
looks
quite
like
scary
a
on
monster
the outside, but it's got a lot of layers on the inside.
Brilliant. Claire and Ian for one, so hedonism's their favorite. Then what was number 4 was a Spaniard, Peat Monster. Then so there's some interesting ones. I think the most distinctive ones are 1 and 3. Interesting from Catherine. 451 says Ruther. 541 also says Scott. There's a nice eclectic mix, which has happened actually on a lot of our recent tastings. I used to always say, because sometimes when the first, I'd say maybe 30 Digital Drams tasting I did, you finish and there was clearly one that would just won the day. And I think last time, I must go back over the video, I'm pretty sure last time you were on, Michael, hedonism ran away with it. But the last few tastings we've done, I don't know if it's people's palates are changing or whether we're on a good run of tastings, but it's been hard to call a winner. I would say just roughly straw polling, I would say it's between the hedonism and the Peat Monster, probably closely followed by the Spaniard, but there's a few other ones in there, so it's quite impressive. Any thoughts on those scores there, Michael, in terms of preference?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know what it is. It's like there's so many different palates out there, and this is why I love it when people come up to our stand at like a whiskey show or something like that. I've got so much to choose from, and I often will just have the conversation with people about what is it that you enjoy drinking, what sort of style of whiskey. And it's a great thing about having these recipes so available, is that you can draw people in based on what they usually like drinking, because we can reveal what is inside of our whiskeys. And it's just, there's something for everyone. If you want a really good sherried whiskey, we've got that. If you want something that's sort of richer and more indulgent, we've got that. Sherry and peat we've got. If you want just peat, we've got it. And I think it's, it's just a very good example of each sort of flavor profile in that category, and it gives you a lot to work with.
No, totally. And Ruther said amazing hedonism and Peat Monster, polar opposites but equally loved. So that also chimes with what you were saying there. Kalak says, I've probably been a bit snobbish about blends in the past, but it's clear that I've been missing out. Compass Box is definitely my watch list now. A bottle of the Glasgow blend for me. Mel says, so glad I joined tonight. Michael, you must be so proud to work for these guys. 1 to 5, 1, 5, 3, 2, 4, amazing whiskey. We'll be getting at least one of each. Brilliant. And Catherine says Dan is debating his next drink is Cale 12 or Lefroy Castrant to follow up. And it's interesting what we're saying about whiskies changing over the years. Lefroy Castrant is one of my favorite examples of that, because it's one of my favorite whiskies. But I picked up batch 1 to 4. I picked up an auction. This is about years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And batch 3, 1 to 3 taste similar, but batch 3 and batch 11, or I think they're on batch 16 now, but batch 3 to batch 11's a different whiskey. If you give them 2 glasses to someone, here you go, totally different whiskey. You would not guess that they were both from the same distillery. So things do evolve, but they're all tremendous whiskies. So brilliant. And Alistair loved the tasting. So thank you for joining, Alistair. Michael, thank you so much for coming on. Absolute pleasure to have you on again. And they are great whiskies, and I'm sure we'll get you on here again in the future, or maybe catch you at one of the stores at the store tastings. And yeah, everyone, as I mentioned at the start, we're hoping there's a Lefroy tasting. It will take place on the 15th of February. Hope to have it on sale by this time next week, if not next Friday. So it'll be on from there, and then we're going to be pretty much hard on it then for the rest of the year until August. We always take a bit of a dip in the summer, Michael, just because it's too hot and it's too bright, and
so no need to sit indoors when the sun's still out.
Exactly, you don't want to be sitting in here on the 15th of August. But every other month in the year, I think they're good for tastings. So brilliant. Alice, I know you thought Middleton Distillery was perhaps too expensive, but a mix of Jameson Redbreast, Spot Powers, Barry Crockett Legacy. If not, how about Oxford Rye? Interesting. I mean, Middleton Distillery produces such a huge range of whiskey. It's a difficult one. And yeah, so we've got some great comments in there. If there's anything we haven't come to, that maybe you want Michael to answer, or myself, just email the link that you got this Zoom tasting from, and we'll come back to you. But yeah, at 9:05, folks, we'll leave you, because I can see people dropping off the call, and I think it's a good place to leave it. So thanks again, Michael, and we'll catch you all soon.
Thanks. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.